There we go. I'm having a nightmare. I'm a bit late. Sorry about that, guys, but I'm here now. There's no lighting. Hold on, let me see if I can get myself a little bit brighter. Stand by, folks. Sorry. I'm all over the place tonight. The reason I'm all over the place is because I was literally watching myself on telly. How bizarre is that? All right, hang on. Are we up and running? Are we good to go? Let me just check everything. Yes, hello everybody. Right, you're all with me. You can pretty much see me. Let's just get myself slightly further over there. There we go. Right, we're good. We're good. Everyone chill. Everyone calm down. We're all under control. Right, thank you. Welcome along. Thank you for joining. I appreciate it as ever. We've got a lot to talk about, haven't we? Because not only have we had one Grand Prix this season, but we've had two, and I wasn't here after the first one because I was away. So I guess we can cover anything from the first two races tonight. Whatever you want to talk about, we will go there. So fire in your questions. Let's start off wherever you want to start. But, I mean, how about yesterday? What a great Grand Prix that was. And I titled this video, Have F1's 2022 Changes Worked? I mean, I think it's a resounding yes. I mean, it's almost a rhetorical question, isn't it? Because so far, they have delivered. I think we've got cars that look great in terms of their styling. They're the kind of cars that I can imagine kids having up on posters on their walls. I think we've got cars that can race each other, which was, of course, the very point of making these changes in the first place. We've got Ferrari back up at the front in the mix. We've got two new title protagonists. Might be a bit early to say that right now, but Charles Leclerc, Max Verstappen, two wonderful drivers going wheel to wheel over and over again in the first two rounds at the very front. And there's no doubt that Lewis Hamilton and potentially George Russell as well will at some point join the party, even though they're a bit behind at this point. So I think this has got the makings of an incredible season, and I'm really, really excited to see what's in store. But, of course, I want to know what you think. Hello, yes, hello to all of you, wherever you are. Hello from Jamaica, says Angry Alan 100. Hello, mate. All over the world, you guys. It's amazing. Still amazes me that you guys are tuning in from all over the place. Someone from Calgary, Dr. Blamo. Hello, mate. Thank you for joining. I'm not going to go through all of this, but thank you. I appreciate every single one of you. Where should we start? Will Carlos tell us every Sunday that he's almost 100%, says Robin Visser. That's a bit harsh. We're two races in, and I think after the first round, I don't think he was saying he was nearly 100%. I think after the first round, he openly accepted that actually he really struggled with that car. And look, these cars, the thing about these cars, right, is that they are a completely new way of driving. You need to have a different driving style to get the best out of them compared to what we've had in the past. And that means drivers have to adapt. Now, you might get lucky and the new type of car might suit the style of a particular driver. But if it doesn't necessarily come naturally to you, you might have to make some adaptations to the way you drive to get the maximum out of it. And that's what's happening up and down the grid now. Lots of drivers and teams still figuring out how to drive them, how to set them up, what kind of setup tweaks, how they react in certain ways to different challenges that the car and driver are facing. All of these things are happening. And on top of that, in the background, there is a development program that's running along, starting to strategically bring upgrades at various points in the season to try and make improvements. So there's a load of stuff that's still to be learned. Very early days. I think Carlos Sainz, I think he's a wonderful driver. I think I've got a lot of time for Carlos. I think he's an absolute brilliant talent. I think this weekend he would openly say he was a lot closer in terms of performance to Charles Leclerc, and I think that will only probably continue as they all start to get used to the machinery they're driving. What else are we saying? They need to stay off the curbs, says Hell Pike. Yes, they do. Staying off the curbs is much more important this year with the new wheels and tyres combination. So we don't have the big squashy balloon tyres that take up a lot of that curb strike that they had before. But on top of that, we've also got undercar aerodynamics being a huge part of keeping the car stuck to the racetrack. And if you bounce over a curb, of course, it unsettles the car, it tips it up, it breaks any seal that you might have, aerodynamically or physically along the underside of the floor, and you lose a chunk of downforce. So staying off the curbs and maybe a slightly longer journey around a corner rather than cutting over a curb to shorten it is actually a quicker way round because your aerodynamics work better and you can travel around that extra distance a bit faster with the additional downforce that you get from maintaining a flat and more level car base. So that is another one of these things that is different about the 22 cars as opposed to the 21 cars. Right. Hello from Toronto. Hello to all of you right around the world. Lots of you still saying hello and thank you. I do appreciate it, of course. Did you find the Jeddah circuit dangerous? Look, the Jeddah circuit I think has a lot to offer in that it's different. And it's different in that it's a street circuit, so it comes with those challenges, but it's also mega quick. Now, is it dangerous? It is dangerous. Motorsport is dangerous. I'm not necessarily in the camp that says this place is so dangerous we should never return. I think we could probably learn from what happened this time around, and we could potentially make tweaks to circuit layouts, to barrier positioning maybe, things like that. Perhaps there are things we can do to minimise any safety or potential safety risk. But I quite like the fact that we've got very fast changes of direction with minimal runoff. The risk factor is high in terms of if you get it wrong, it's costly. It becomes a problem if the risk factor is high when the risk factor comes with a danger, a massive, serious danger attached to it. And I think we're on the brink of that at Jeddah. The cars now, of course, are incredibly safe in comparison to years gone by. And look, Mick Schumacher walked away from a monumental shunt with no major injuries at all, which is great. It destroyed the car, but there were no injuries to the driver. And that, of course, is the only real thing that matters here. So I think we've got a sport now and a car that's so safe, relatively speaking, that the circuits can allow the circuits to introduce a little bit more risk in terms of the risk of biting if you get it wrong. And, you know, yes, that can end up in a wall at Jeddah. But I also like the fact that from a driving perspective, as opposed to a circuit with acres and acres of runoff, there are consequences to getting it wrong. You know, that's what pushes the drivers to the limit, sometimes beyond it, but we get to see the drivers teetering on the edge of their limits and the car's limits. And that is, I think, what we want to see as Formula One fans from the cars and the driver's perspective. So I kind of like it from that angle. Of course, we never want to see anyone get hurt, but I'm not necessarily in the camp that says that circuit just has to go immediately. I mean, what do you think? Should the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix be reviewed after this weekend's events? So I presume what you're talking about are all sorts of events happened this weekend. There was the big crash from Mick Schumacher, and I think perhaps we've covered that already. But there was also the other event that happened on Friday where some sort of missile strike struck an oil refinery close to the circuit. That's obviously way more serious and much bigger than Formula One. So that is not necessarily a Formula One specific risk, but it's a risk to any event being staged in that region if security can't manage to handle or deal with threats like that. And if there are threats like that, any major event, I think, would start to question whether they want to be there or should be there. So that's a more political, a more security-centered question, which I guess is not so much for this particular forum, I guess. Right. Hang on. I like the way that the FIA have gone about their job so far, says Mr. AJ Scotty. I think it's been handled well so far, don't you? I mean, I think there's nothing. Look, we haven't had any really controversial incidents, and it's those moments when, you know, those decisions are on the line and under the microscope. We haven't really had too many of those yet. We're going to get them. Of course we're going to get them. We're going to get the big incidents where the stewards have to decide on blame for a particular incident, and it might be a major incident at the front end with two of the major contenders. Then the focus and the spotlight will be thrown much more firmly onto the stewards and potentially the FIA as a whole. So, but I think you've got to give credit to the FIA and to Formula One for putting together a set of regulations, putting together a format for Formula One for 2022 that seemingly is working so far. I mean, that's why I titled the video in the way I have, because I feel like it's a major success. Even though we're only 2 races in, all the signs look positive. I mean, in my podcast this week, my audio podcast, Pit Lane Life Lessons, check it out if you haven't already, I talked about how in the past, Formula One has often made what seem like knee-jerk reactions to problems that we might be encountering, and we make a rule change off the back of that to try and overcome the problem, but it has a knock-on or unintended consequence as a result of that, which might be a bigger negative than the problem they were trying to fix in the first place. This time around, they've gone about it in a much more sensible way. They have invited all the stakeholders to take part in the discussions, to come up with the solutions to the problems that we're facing, to re-look at the rules every few months, to analyse them, to pick holes in them, to find the loopholes. And they can go back and write those loopholes out of the regulations. And so what we've ended up with is a set of regs which in theory should have less unintended consequences than we've had in years gone by. And it feels at the moment, although it is early days, that we're getting that. Okay, why was Max moaning about Charles and the pit lane? It looked like he barely ran over it. I mean, look, this is what drivers do, isn't it? Particularly when they're hunting each other down for the lead. Max thought that Charles stuck his wheels over the pit lane line, which you are not allowed to do. Very clearly, that was ruled out in the race director's notes this weekend. You are not allowed to drop wheels over that pit lane entry unless you are going into the pit lane. And Max thought that Charles had dropped a wheel or two over it, just a small amount, but dropped a wheel over it once or twice on a couple of laps, and he was flagging it, which is what any driver would do in that situation. So I don't think we need to blame Max for that. It didn't come to anything, so the FIA or the stewards have access to all kind of camera angles that can pretty clearly and definitively tell if a driver did that or not. So I guess we have to assume that actually he didn't. Right, hang on. F1 is now how F1 should have been at least 10 years ago. I'm surprised the long-standing rear wing air disruption issue wasn't dealt with much earlier. So, look, yes is the answer to that. We have had a problem with aerodynamics coming off one car and disturbing the car behind. And that has led to, a sort of a difficulty in chasing and following and then therefore overtaking. What we're seeing this year, and this was the intention of the regulations, was to eject the messy, turbulent wake from the lead car up high in the air, way up above the car that's chasing. So you create this pocket of air behind in which you're able to follow undisturbed or relatively undisturbed. The wake that used to be ejected out the side of the car using blown axles and blowing air through the brake ducts and out through the wheel rims, that's all now gone. Deflectors are gone, because what we used to do is we used to throw that wake out in this big mess out the sides of the car, which again filtered in behind, creating this huge swirling mess for the chasing car to run into, and therefore the moment you ran into that, you lose all your downforce and you can't follow. And the biggest impact that I think we're seeing differently this year, we saw yesterday very clearly, was when one car manages to get past another, overtakes another car. The car that's been overtaken in previous years would have all of a sudden, in that second, would have lost all downforce, and tyres would have overheated as they start to slide. Very quickly they disappear. Now what's happening is they can get overtaken, but they can still tuck in behind, a bit like karting, and they can find a way back past. And so we're seeing multiple changes for the lead, because cars are able to still tuck in behind the car in front and stay close without destroying tyres. So that seems to me, on that level at the very least, a massive success. And I'm really pleased, because what we've seen off the first two races, I think is a huge success so far. Exactly what we want to see. So yes, it could have well have been done years ago, but let's just focus on the fact it's been done now, and we should be grateful for that. And I'm looking forward to what comes next. Right. What was Lewis thinking when a dashing Dane was overtaking in a Haas? Well, look, that's the state of play right now. We mustn't disrespect Kevin Magnussen or the Haas team in relation to Mercedes. Mercedes at the moment have not done a very good job, relatively speaking, to where they were last year. Haas have done an exceptionally good job, relatively speaking, to where they were last year. And now they find themselves in the same bit of racetrack in most races. So that's not, we shouldn't be looking at Lewis saying you must be absolutely disappointed with this and mortified to see a Haas coming past you. He'll be mortified that his car's not fighting at the front. But the fact that Haas and Kevin Magnussen are doing a really strong job is a real positive, and they deserve massive credit for that. So Lewis and Mercedes have the might of Mercedes behind them. They have the very best people, huge resource behind them, and I have no doubt they will find their way out of the problem that they've got. I hear already that there's a brand new floor for that Mercedes coming to the next race in Australia. A huge part of that is to try and overcome this porpoising problem of the car bouncing, in which they seem to suffer so much more than anybody else. And I heard George Russell over the weekend saying 95% of the problems they're having is because of the porpoising. If they can eliminate that, well, all of a sudden they can start working on the car. At the moment, they're simply hampered by a setup that has to minimise the porpoising, and yet they can't focus on a setup that will deliver an outright ultimate lap time, which is costing them dearly over these first couple of races. Right, they must change some DRS lines, for example, to mid-corner instead of the braking zones. Okay, so let's talk about this then, because it got a bit silly, didn't it? It got a bit silly towards the end of the Grand Prix between Max and Charles yesterday, and we've seen it before, it's not brand new, where nobody wanted to cross the DRS line first because the knock-on effect of that was, with this incredibly long straight coming up next, DRS was so powerful that you are just a sitting duck, and there is no way you can defend against a fast car behind you with DRS along that long straight. So it made more sense to almost jump on the brakes, almost bring your car to a halt in an attempt not to cross the line ahead of your rival and therefore get DRS, because you know along the long straight you'll be able to get him back. So I agree with you. I think that's something that can be tweaked ahead of the next time we visit this circuit. I think it can be, the DRS line can be moved. I mean, I wonder if we could even lose DRS. It's one of those things that's going to be constantly up for debate now, because we can follow so closely along a long straight like that in Jeddah. Simply the slipstream effect could well be enough along that length of that straight to find your way past. If you can go around the final couple of corners close to your rival, just the good old-fashioned slipstream should get you past. DRS, of course, don't forget, was brought in to enable cars to close up when the aerodynamics were forcing them to drop back. So there is an argument that, and this is not just what I'm saying, this is an argument that is very much in the domain of Formula One, the powers that be in Formula One. It's a discussion that's been had and continues to be had, where we are thinking very seriously about losing DRS from Formula One. We may not need it anymore. It was always going to be brought in for the start of these regulations just to see whether we need it or not. But if we don't, we can potentially get rid of it. So I'm just going to check if that's, I look quite dark there. I was wondering if you can see me. There we go. That's maybe better. Let's see what we got next. Ferrari is a beauty car this year indeed, says Timu. It is. The Ferrari's looking very, very strong. I think they've got a really solid car generally. Now, they opted this weekend for a much higher downforce setup than the Red Bull did. Red Bull went very deliberately the other way, low downforce to maximise the speed on the straights, and you saw the difference. But Ferrari managed to deliver their lap time through the twisty bits because the downforce was there. And, you know, in theory, in that sense, you tend to look after tyres better. I actually thought Red Bull looked after their tyres very well, it seemed, this weekend, even with the low downforce setup, and that might bode well for them and their car. But two very different approaches to this circuit from two very different cars that delivered a lap time in qualifying that was, I mean, nothing between them. Almost identical. Very, very closely matched, but delivering their performance in different ways. And that I find really interesting. If we can get Marc to join the party, they will be another example of that. Another car delivering lap time in a slightly different way. But perhaps if we can get them up in the fight, we can get them to mix it on a very similar performance level. What do you think of the rumours that Spa will be gone next year? A real shame if that's the case. It will be a real shame to lose such an iconic racetrack as Spa. I think, you know, the thing with Spa is, I mean, look, I've been going there for years. As a competitor, it's not the best place to go. You're in the middle of nowhere. There's nothing to do in the evenings particularly. So from a fans, a sponsors, a guest's perspective, you are limited in terms of entertainment because you're literally stuck out in the forest. So from an F1 event perspective, you know, and they have to put some focus on the major players who bring cash into this sport. The big sponsors, the big expensive guests that are brought into this racetrack on behalf of sponsors. You know, what do you do with them in the evenings? When you go to Singapore, when you go to Monaco, it's obvious there's plenty of scope for entertainment. It becomes a great weekend. It becomes an appealing weekend for all those people. They want to be there. Spa has something else. Spa has an incredible circuit. So the racing is spectacular. The circuit's spectacular. The scenery is spectacular. The history of the place, unbelievable. But there is this other, slightly more glamorous side of Formula One, the hospitality and entertainment side, that Spa perhaps doesn't suit quite so well. And it's a factor. It shouldn't be the main factor because by far the majority of people watching that racetrack are watching on television where they just want to see the racing and the racetrack come to the fore. But there is an element of Formula One that has to cater for these major players who do bring a lot of money into the sport. And it could be that that's one of the factors. You never know. Spa's epic, says McLaren F1 race. I couldn't agree more. It is epic. And it would be a real shame if it were to go. Right, thoughts on Stefano De Micali's idea of 25 to 30 races a year. Is it too much? So it depends who you ask, doesn't it? And it also depends how you run the sport. You could not do 30 races a year the way we do it now. I mean, it's just physically not possible. But if you change the format, if you change the layout, if you change the way we went racing, absolutely it's possible. 30 races a year is very doable if we completely change the way we think about it in terms of how we travel around the world, which order we find our ways travelling around the world, how long the race weekends end up being. Can we shorten them even further? Do we allow teams to increase their size to start rotating people through so they don't do every weekend? There are lots of ways we could manage to do 30 races. The bigger question for me, and this is one I'll put back to you guys, I'd love your answers on this. Would you want 30 races? Would you want... I mean, look, in theory, you're a Formula One fan, massive fans, many of you. Would you want a Grand Prix every weekend if you could have one? Do you love it that much that if you could turn the telly on every weekend and there was a race, you'd be there to watch it? Or would it dilute the sport for you? Would it take away some of the magic of the build-up, the waiting for another race weekend, and then you gather around your TV and you get the build-up and the anticipation for that big event? It's an interesting concept, and it's a question that's been bandied around for years, and I don't know the answer to this because there are split camps, but I'd love to know what you think. 30 is too many, way too many. Absolutely, says Lewis Nichols. Yes, every weekend, scuffed Andy. No, too many races. Hell no, says Higana. Yes, Hell Pike. Yes. Yes, no, 30 is too much. 10 races should be in an oval. Interesting. Nope, says Kevin507. No, because drivers would probably get tired. Oh, come on. We're not suddenly going to have sympathy for drivers getting tired, are we? Look, in the same way, I'm joking, of course, but in the same way that if we went to something like 30 races or more, we could rotate and we'd have to change the way we think about racing from a team perspective. Maybe it has to be done for the drivers. Maybe the drivers don't do every race either. So there's lots of, you know, we're thinking about it in the way that we think about Grand Prix racing today. If we wanted the sport to go to 30 races, we'd have to rewrite the rule book, rethink how we do that, what it looks like. I mean, literally completely rethink it. It's doable, but it's a very different sport to the one we're used to today. That would be my thought. So I guess from you guys, there is a total mix, and that is the problem that Formula One has always had, because this is a question that's been raised for years, and there's a huge split down the middle of who would like to have more and more races from a fan perspective, and who is very happy to keep it on a limited number. Some people can't commit that amount of time. Some people can and would love to. It's a mix. Right, let's move it on. So Christopher Allwood says, I need a week or so to digest each race. And that's also a good point. Keeping the conversation going between races is something that Formula One's getting better at doing. Telling stories around Grand Prix, bringing up the subjects and the talking points that matter after a race to keep the conversation going. That's something that we're actually getting better and better at, given the current schedule. And I think we could do even more in that sense. So if you had a race every weekend, again, that's something that completely changes the way we go about that side, the media side, the storytelling side. Mika Kiimba says, I'd watch F1 every single day if it was available. Right, so let's try and move it on to another question. I'm just trying to find another question. Hockenheim should be on the calendar. Such a great track. Now we get to all those junk Middle East tracks. So I would say that the Middle East tracks are not all junk. I think Bahrain has a lot to offer. I think there's been some great racing in Bahrain over the years. So I wouldn't just categorise all Middle East tracks as being junk. I think Hockenheim is a great circuit, and if we could find a spot for it on the calendar, then wonderful. But there just isn't the appetite for 2 races in Germany. That was the reason that one of them got dropped in the first place. And if we did go to Hockenheim, someone's got to pay for it. And as ever, that's always the hardest thing because it's expensive. You need to find a way to recoup that money. There needs to be a big enough interest in the sport in that region to entice ticket sales. Fans need to get behind a driver from that nation. It could be that Mick Schumacher is that guy. A bit early in his career yet, but look what happened. Look at the Michael Schumacher effect. What that had on Germany and German race fans. It could potentially be that Mick Schumacher could do something similar in his career as he moves forward. We'll have to wait and see. But drivers and teams that fans can get behind often have a major impact in the region and the popularity in that region of a sport, and therefore how easy it is to justify bringing a race to any particular territory like that. How can Mercedes improve the correlation between the car and the simulator? It's a constant learning process, and what you have to do is you gradually build up real-world data, which is what they're doing now. Modern Formula One, that's one of the toughest things to do. Modern Formula One doesn't have the opportunity to build up real-world data like we used to when I first started, because we had a separate test team that was travelling around the world constantly with its own cars, its own trucks, mechanics, engineers, drivers even, and we'd constantly be doing mileage almost every day, building up data reserves about our car, about new components. And therefore, when you get massive amounts of real-world data, it's much easier, of course, to compare that to simulated data, virtual data, and compare that correlation, fine-tune that correlation. If it's not right, if it's not as you expect it to be, you test in the real world and you start to tweak the algorithms, you start to tweak the codes for the virtual world to bring that mismatch back into a better correlation. Mercedes are doing that now, but they're much more limited today on what sort of real world data they can get. They've got 2 races worth now, and that will help them. As the races go on, that will become better and better and easier to do, and it will be a gradual learning process, little bit by little bit, to a point where they eventually, hopefully, find a really nice, smooth transition between the simulator world, the virtual world, and the real world, and therefore your development path becomes so much easier. You can make changes in the virtual world overnight and test these things. You can try stuff out, setups. You can try different ride heights, different front wings and aero levels and all sorts of things like that in the virtual world overnight. And then you send the results through to the racetrack, and you don't need to waste that time actually trying those things with the car on the track when you've got limited time available to you. So it's a really valuable resource, but if it's not working, it's not much of a resource to you. Should F1 eliminate the $250 million entry fee? I think they will do if they need more entries into the sport. At the moment, given that there's massive change in the sport right now, they have decided they don't really want any extra entries. They're not desperate for more people to join at this moment in time. And so that entry fee is there to fend off any of the jokers, of which we've had many in the past. If we get to a point, though, where a couple of big teams dropped out, I suspect you might see that entry fee being waived because Formula One would be desperate to bring more teams into the sport. So it's one of those things. It's a sort of little fender to keep people away when they don't want them. I suspect it would be removed when they do want those people to come back in when we need them. Right. I don't think we want to see an American influence on F1. Well, why not? We've got an American influence on F1. The sport is owned by an American media company, and a lot of what they've done, Liberty Media I'm talking about, I think you've got to say is positive. The Netflix Drive to Survive is a huge, monumental success. What they set out to achieve, they have exceeded by a massive amount what they tried to achieve with that show. It's brought in millions of fans to the sport. Their whole mandate is to grow the sport. And Drive to Survive was one really key and clever way to do that, and it's working, and it continues to work. So there's lots of things that the American media company that now own this sport have brought in that are positive. Access from a fan's perspective, access behind the scenes, allowing teams and drivers to film inside the paddock, getting visual video access that we've never had before other than the major broadcasters. Getting videos from the teams from inside the garages, something we never had access to before. A lot of these things are changes that have happened off the back of an American media company taking control of this sport. So I think that's harsh to say we don't want an American impact or an American influence on the sport. I think we want an influence on the sport that's going to grow the sport for the better, that's going to make it bigger, that's going to expand into new markets. America is definitely one of those markets. The fact that we're going to Miami this year is one of those things that's been influenced, no doubt, by the American owners of the sport. And I think it's a great thing. Why not try and tap into a marketplace that's still relatively untapped? The whole point, if we can grow Formula One to be bigger and bigger and bigger and better, well, it's better for all of us. So let's wait and see how this plays out. But I don't think we should be too quick to judge an American influence on the sport as being a bad thing. There is much more access under Liberty Media, says Thomas Holo. Yeah, I agree, totally. Are McLaren just having braking problems? They seemed pretty good in testing. So McLaren have got a few issues. I think braking, the overheating braking was definitely one of those. I think they have implemented fixes for that problem, but I don't think it's the full permanent fix yet. I think, given they've got the problem that they found in pre-season testing, which limited their running massively, we went to Bahrain with a very temporary fix on the car, which was draggy. You know, it came at a cost of aerodynamic drag, and so therefore they're hampered by that in terms of the overall aero setup. The second race came 1 week later, so we had a very similar setup. I didn't see if it was exactly the same, but it was a very similar setup on the car for the second round. I would expect them to redesign that area of the car. And in fact, they will be definitely redesigning that area of the car at the moment, and probably we'll see a much more permanent, much more efficient fix come onto the car moving forward, maybe for Australia. But I'm sure that's not the only thing. Don't forget, these are brand new cars with a completely different way of thinking, from a design to an operation to a development process. Everything's different. So everyone's got stuff to work out and stuff to figure out and stuff to fine tune. So I don't think we need to write McLaren off. I think there's glimmers of performance with McLaren. There's enough to sort of suggest that they have some pace. They haven't unlocked it yet, but when they do, a little bit like Mercedes, there's potential for them to move forward. These people, like I said about Mercedes, have got great people behind the scenes. They've got great facilities and resources at their disposal. These are the teams, the McLarens, the Mercedes of this world, who, if they find themselves in trouble, like they are at the moment, have the best shot of digging their way out. I know we're under a budget cap this year, But even so, they've still already got the best people in place. They don't have to go and buy the best people. They've already got them. They've already got wonderful facilities at their disposal. This is an advantage that the big teams have over the smaller teams who, will find it much harder to buy in the expertise. They can't now go out into the market and buy or bring in the best people. They can't suddenly replace some of their resource or their equipment with the very best equipment because they're now budget capped. But the big teams already have it in place. So that I think will be the difference between the different teams up and down the pit lane and the immediate impact that the cost cap will have. Yes, it levels the playing field. Over many years, it will level it even more. But in the beginning, the big teams are still the big teams. JP Stone says, this American loves F1. Well, good on you, JP. I think the fact that we're getting more and more Americans into the sport in terms of a fan base, again, much of which comes through Drive to Survive, I think is great because it just expands the sport into another area of the world where perhaps it hasn't been expanded into too much so far. Got to be a good thing. I expected Aston Martin to be better, says Hell Pike. So did I. Yeah, really disappointed with them at the moment. I actually also expected bigger things. I also expected or hoped for bigger things from Williams. I think they look to me like they have the worst car on the grid. Alex Albon is showing signs of being decent. It's very difficult to judge in that car, but Latifi has not had a good start to the season, has he? So let's hope that they as a team can drag themselves together. Right. I was hoping McLaren would be up the front this year. Yeah, oh, me too, believe me. It's so heartbreaking and disappointing for McLaren having made such progress over the last couple of years, particularly last year. They had flashes of absolute brilliance last year, and they've taken a giant step backwards. But look, when you get a massive rule shake-up like this, that can happen. It can happen really easily, and it can be tiny differences, that catapult you from the front end of the grid to the back or vice versa. And that's why we're seeing a bit of a shake-up. That's why we're seeing a Haas mixing it in the top 4 or 5. That's why we're seeing the Mercedes, struggling down the back on occasion. That's what the rule shake-ups do. They shake up the grid. It will settle itself out. Performance will begin to converge. But at the moment, the opportunities are there for those who get it right. And the challenge is there for those who are currently getting it wrong. Here we go. No, I'm not even going to say it. No, I'm going to say it. Latifi is your new Bottas. I can see it already. Who's this? John Norris. Latifi for scooter rental assistant manager. There we go. That didn't take long. Bottas is now flying high, isn't he? We've got to say, isn't it great for Valtteri? Isn't it nice to see him, just from a feel-good factor, to see him dumped out of that Mercedes team and yet actually performing at a higher level than the Mercedes on many occasions. I think it's great. It's really great for them, for the whole team, that they've got a car now that seems to be, performing really well. So let's see. Is Mercedes engine the worst? None of the Merc-powered cars is doing well. I think, look, this is the last... What all the engine manufacturers had to do ahead of this season was bring their final upgrades, because now everything's locked in. So everybody, or most people, went reasonably big on trying to re-engineer the final bits of performance that they could from what they'd learnt over the last year or so into this year's engine. Honda did it for Red Bull. Ferrari, of course, have been doing it on their fight back from the disappointment of a couple of years ago. The Renault engine, the Alpine, seemingly making small steps each year, and maybe they have a half-decent engine this year too. Mercedes, I don't know if they've not improved as much as others. They've always had a very strong engine, and I'm pretty sure that engine will still be strong. I think the Mercedes factory team is suffering with all manner of different troubles right now, and that's masking any performance from an engine perspective or otherwise. It could be that Aston Martin also have a pretty poor car, and it could be coincidental that they're both running Mercedes engines. Williams, have been at the back for years with a Mercedes engine, so it's very difficult to judge whether the Mercedes engine has taken a giant leap backwards or everyone else taken a giant leap forwards, or whether it's just the 3 individual Mercedes-powered cars that are also struggling for independent reasons. Time will tell as the season starts to play on. Bottas is back. Yes, he is. Yeah, and he's loving life, isn't he? Red Bull will have engine issues soon. Look at the last 2 races. Well, who knows? Red Bull, they didn't have an engine issue in the first race. It was a fuel pickup problem, as I'm sure most of you know. I'm not sure that there's anything to suggest that Red Bull will have engine issues. I know that was it Yuki, wasn't it? Yuki Tsunoda had issues. So there are clearly some fragilities. Whether they're all centred around that engine, I don't know. I haven't seen the absolute report on what happened to the AlphaTauri yet. But look, they may have some areas of concern, but they got 2 cars to the end of the race yesterday very, very quickly, and that has got to be taken as a positive. Right, hold on. Kevin's stock has risen immensely. Yes, it has, absolutely, and rightly so. Latifi to Tim Horton's delivery, says Derek Wilkinson. Thank you, Derek. No problem for Red Bull's engine, says Hellpike. We shall see. Is Marc really down on power? Again, don't know. A difficult one to answer. Sky need to teach Jensen how to say Charles Leclerc. I'm going to leave that one. Can we talk about the? Can we talk about the Alonso versus Ocon in the race yesterday? Says Matt Potter. Yes, we can. Alonso versus Ocon. Well, it was brilliant entertainment. I think from a fan's perspective, from a neutral's perspective, I loved it. If I was in that team, I'd have first of all had my fist in my mouth, but secondly, I'd be questioning why on earth are we allowing this to happen for such a long period of time, when clearly in letting them race like that, they're hampering the team's overall performance. They're slowing each other down. And look, they could have very easily taken each other out, which would have been disastrous. They didn't, but it was fine margins. I thought the move where Fernando was closing on Ocon, and Ocon just jinked a little bit towards the pit wall, Fernando had to massively back out of it. I thought that was very borderline. I don't think the gap was big enough really for Fernando to find his way through there anyway. So even if Ocon had held his line perfectly straight, I think it would have been very, very tight for Fernando to squeeze his way through. But that's kind of not the point. The point is these are 2 teammates racing each other, and it seemed like Ocon was prepared to do almost anything to stop him getting past. Fernando was almost prepared to do anything to get past, and typically, in my experience, those situations don't end well. They got away with it this weekend, but if that's the way they're going to go racing over the course of a season, and given that they've got the 2 cars that are the same performance level, they're going to find themselves on the same bit of racetrack regularly. I would have said the team needs to have a bit of a word about, some sort of rules of engagement. Not team orders, but just that if they're in that situation, let's let one get down the road. Let's help each other to accelerate and move the pair of them further along. Let's not worry about who comes out of the last corner in front. Let's have an agreement that for 5 laps, we're just going to drag each other down the road. We're going to help each other to move forward. And then after that, let's see what happens. Let's see where we are. Let's shake it up or work it out through pit stops. That's what I would have done if I was team principal. But with my fans hat on, I loved it. They went motor racing and I loved every bit of it, says DH. Yeah, I loved it all too. Could Schumacher's chassis be reused, and how much work goes into rebuilding a new car? Good question. Schumacher's chassis, can it be reused? I don't know the answer to that because I haven't seen it. Typically, if the chassis is seriously damaged, like structurally damaged, it can be repaired and will be put back into the pot, probably as some kind of spare. But what would normally happen is you'll just take the next new chassis from the production line and you'd build that one up. It does depend on obviously how bad the damage was. If there was damage to the chassis, it depends what it was, how bad it was, how structured it was, how easy to repair it was, and whether a repair can be made safely without making the chassis massively heavy. That's the other compromise you often make. If you have to make a major repair, a lot of the filler, a lot of the glue that goes into that ends up being heavy and will compromise your overall car weight. The teams are on, a massive mission to try and keep car weight down this year because many of them are struggling to reach that minimum limit. So I suspect the more obvious solution will be to take the next new chassis to build it up. How much work's involved? I mean, a lot. It's a huge amount of work, but it's the same amount of work that typically happens every race, or almost the same. Because most cars will get stripped down to almost nothing anyway after these first two races. They'll get stripped down to a bare chassis. What they often won't do is take out things like the hard hydraulic lines that will be mounted inside the chassis. A lot of the fixtures and fittings on the inside to cope with things like rocker mounts, suspension mounts, those kind of things, well, they might be able to stay in there normally. But if you are changing chassis, then everything's got to come out. Everything. Hard brake lines or hydraulic lines, wiring harnesses, every single bracket, everything would have to come out when you're changing to another chassis. So it does increase the workload, but not massively more than when you were doing a full strip down at the end of that first two races anyway. I suspect that's what they'll do though. All right. Are Mercedes struggling because Andy Cowell left? No, I don't think it can be attributed to that. I think they've got aerodynamic issues is their biggest problem, and that wasn't his area. Should Mercedes bring in De Vries for Hamilton? Really? Okay, what do you think about Lewis's comments about questioning if he gets points for 10th? It made me chuckle. If you didn't catch that, at the end of the Grand Prix on Lewis's radio, when Bono told him he was P10 at the end of the race, Lewis said, "Oh, do we even get a point for that?" And it was one of those comments, he knows you get a point for 10th. It was one of those comments where it was just disdain for where he's ended up in the race. And, that's understandable. He's not used to being back there. He had a very hard race, a long fought race, which probably felt like it went on forever. And to just end up P10 after all of that, after fighting his way back inside the top 10 and then finding himself back in P10 at the end, he's just disappointed. And that's how Lewis often manifests that, isn't it? He comes out with a comment that that I know he knows the answer to that question. Do we get a point for 10th? Yes, Lewis, you get one. He knows the answer to that. But he was upset, he was frustrated, and I think that's all he was doing at that moment. Right. What is a setup on an F1 car? Okay, well, in general terms, when we talk about the car setup, we're talking about the configuration of that car for that particular session or for that particular race weekend. Now, setup can be everything from the aerodynamic setup, and that would be the aero package that you take. So your overall downforce levels. Monaco would have a very high downforce setup. Monza would have a much lower downforce setup. That's your wing level settings. It's the components around the car that generate downforce. But there's also mechanical car setup, and that is things like suspension geometries, spring selections, damper selections, ride heights, caster angles, camber angles, all manner of different things that you can adjust, anti-roll bars. All the things you can adjust on a Formula One car are put into what we call the setup. And typically what happens is the engineer, so after conversations overnight, let's say on a Friday night, after the debrief between the engineers, the chief mechanic, the race driver, you'll come up with what you think is the best setup or tweaks to the setup between Friday and Saturday. Then the engineer will produce a setup sheet, which is literally a bit of paper or an email which says, has a sort of spreadsheet with all of these details on the components that they want fitting for the Saturday morning session, which number springs they want, which anti-roll bars they want, what the ride heights are, what the weight distribution is going to be, tyre pressures. All of these different things can be put into a setup sheet. It's just a collection of numbers and digits and components that need to be fitted to the car. So that's what we mean when we talk about setup. Setup can constantly be tweaked. You might come in at the end of a run and they might say, well, I've got a little bit too much a high-speed oversteer and through turn whatever, and then the engineer might say, okay, let's drop the rear ride height by 0.5 millimetre, and then you'll go in, and that's a setup change. So you'll drop the rear ride height literally by 0.5 millimetre. That's an average setup change on ride height. It's not very much. Drop it by 0.5 millimetre or 1 millimetre. Send the car out again, see what it does. That's tweaking the setup. So apologies if I'm teaching you stuff you already know, but when we talk about setup or car setup, those are the kind of parameters that we're talking about. The things you can change between session to session on the car that the mechanics go through before the car goes out and the driver gets in. That's setup. I hope that answers your question. I hope that's what you meant. Is there a new series of Wheeler Dealers? Our Wheeler Dealer question. There's a brand new series of Dream Car, which is on right now. It's on just before this show. We're in the middle of that play out right now. We're now making the next series of Wheeler Dealers. So haven't got a date when it'll be on the telly yet, but we're making it now. So yes, it's coming. Should the pit have stayed closed as long as it was? Seemed a little deliberate. Oh, come on, Matthew Baptiste. I knew there'd be some people who'd have conspiracy theories. You can't muck about when there's marshals in the pit lane pushing cars in and out of gaps. That pit lane was closed for as long as it had to be closed, and I'm gonna go out there and say you're a Lewis Hamilton fan. Yes, it was harsh. Yes, Lewis was unlucky. I don't think it actually cost him much in terms of his overall race position. You've got to keep the pit lane closed if there's marshals working on stranded cars in there. It's literally as simple as that. They didn't keep it closed for any longer than they had to keep the marshals safe. And that's it. There's no conspiracy. What is a downforce point? Oh, goodness, we are getting technical here. We've only got 8 minutes left. A downforce point is it's how downforce is measured. So when the aero teams inside the factory are running wind tunnel tests and calculating downforce, they calculate their downforce into a series of percentage points. Excuse me. And then if they tweak something or change something, they can then use that as a gauge for adding or removing downforce. So if a setup change, if a new front wing, for example, increases downforce by 3 points, then it's just a way of measuring downforce from a given set starting point. So it doesn't actually mean there's no calculation, there's no actual quantifiable number other than in relation to a known quantity that they've started that measurement from. So it's up or down by a point from their set starting point. That's what it means. I hope that answers your question. Right. Should F1 get rid of tyre blankets? Well, they are. There is a plan to gradually, you may have seen this year, they've lowered the maximum temperature that you can set your tyre blankets to. So we're now going to get lower and lower over the next few years. So over the next 3 or 4 years, you'll get to a point where tyre blankets are having a minimal impact, and then they go, and then they get banned. So they disappear. The point of losing them is mostly on a cost-saving ground. So we don't need to buy them, first of all, but we don't need to haul them around the world. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of tyre blankets, and all the control boxes, they're heavy. So if we can lose them, and if it's the same for everybody, of course, there's no problem in terms of performance differentiation. And so that's what we're working towards. We're going to lower the tyre temperatures, tyre blanket temperatures gradually to the point where we don't need them anymore, and then they'll go. So it's happening. I don't know when Wheeler Dealers or Dream Cars coming to Canada, but keep an eye on my socials and you will be the first to know, after me, second to know. Right, where are we? We've got 5 minutes to go. Thank you for giving up your Monday evenings for us. Wasn't that nice? Thank you, Matthew. I appreciate that. And I'm sorry for insulting you if you're a Lewis Hamilton fan. I wasn't taking the mickey. Well, I was taking the mickey, but I appreciate those kind words. Right. Are there more doors or wheels? Oh. Did anyone ever come up with a conclusion? I mean, I don't know. I'm going to say wheels. But let's not get into that discussion. Right. Come on, another F1 question to finish up. Lots of Wheeler Dealers questions, which I really appreciate. But let's keep it F1 for the last couple of moments. Keep an eye on my socials for Wheeler Dealer updates. I will bang anything I've got on there. Right. Okay. Do you think Red Bull and Ferrari will use even less paint on a car? I think they will, because it's just about fine margins, Formula One. It's about saving weight in any areas you can, and if that's a way of doing it, they will continue to do it. So yes, that is going to to keep happening, I'm sure. Have a beer on me with virtual YouTube money, says McLaren F1 face. Thanks, man. I will. I appreciate it. Thank you. Come on, one more F1 question for the last 3 minutes. We've covered the braking before the DRS line. Are Aston Martin missing Otmar Safnauer? Seems like the performance went with him. I don't think there's a correlation there. Otmar's a great guy. I love him to bits. I think he's got a lot to offer a team. He's a very calm, level-headed guy on that pit wall. I think he'll run the team well, but I don't think the performance went with him. You've got to remember, brand new cars, totally different cars. This was always going to be a slight lottery as to who got it right and who got it wrong. So you can't make that attribution. Will the... hang on. Is Mercedes sandbagging? Nice one, RV. Oh, come on, I want one more good question with 2 minutes to go. Okay, can we talk about the impact of the steward's decision to not penalise drivers for not slowing down under yellow? I mean, I can't talk about it too much because I don't fully understand it yet. I actually haven't read their report, if I'm really honest today. But it seems strange because I'm pretty sure Charles Leclerc set the fastest race lap whilst the yellow flags were out. And that in itself, to me, seems utterly bizarre. Correct me if I'm wrong, I could be wrong on that, but I'm sure that fastest lap popped up in the last 2 laps of the race when there were yellows out in Sector 1. How on earth are you able to set the fastest lap when there's yellows? I don't know. But there seemed to be a lot of confusion around those last couple of laps and drivers not slowing down enough under yellows, and yet it felt like they've decided not to get into that can of worms because it could well be that many of the drivers, maybe even all of the drivers, didn't slow down enough. I'm not sure I saw anyone slowing down to a point where they're prepared to stop, which is what double wave yellows is supposed to mean. If you're going to take it by the letter of the law, which they should, if we're going to embark on a new era of safety and of a judiciary process in Formula One with new race directors and all the rest of it, new processes in place, we should be setting a precedent now. And particularly around safety, it's a good one to come down hard on them, but they didn't. So I don't really know. I can't really explain more than that. I don't have the answers, I'm afraid, but I will look into it and maybe we'll come back to it next week. I mean, guys, that's it. That's it. Prediction for Australia. Oh, my goodness, I have no idea. I still think you're going to find Red Bull and Ferrari are going to be the 2 quick teams again. So it's going to be more of the same, I'm sure. Mercedes have a brand new floor coming to Australia, which could, and the hope is that it will start to eliminate some of that porpoising effect. If that happens, maybe we'll see them joining the front few as well. Who knows? Have a wonderful week, guys. I'm going to go and enjoy this. If you haven't checked out my podcast yet, Pit Lane Life Lessons, it's all over my socials today. You can find it in any of the podcast stores by searching Pit Lane Life Lessons. I'd love it if you check it out, and I'd love to know what you think. Have a wonderful week, guys, and I will see you all very, very soon. Thanks so much for joining. Ta-da.